The story unfolds upon a desolate battlefield strewn with corpses, the aftermath of a cataclysmic war that had ravaged the martial world. Among the countless fallen, only three figures still drew breath: Shaolin abbot Hyun Jinshin, Mount Hua sect leader Zhang Guang, and Namgung clan patriarch Huang Huang. Realizing that their adversary stood wounded and weary, Huang roared for his comrades to strike, his voice echoing through the blood-soaked plains. Yet the man before them, known across the realm as the Divine Demon, merely glared with crimson eyes and replied with chilling composure that now only they remained. Abbot Jinshin lunged forward, channeling his inner chi into the heavenly Buddha palm strike, but his attack was effortlessly deflected. The Divine Demon retaliated with a swift sword strike, forcing Jinshin to raise his staff in defense while shouting for his allies to join the assault. Zhang Guang unleashed the Plum Blossom Flash strike, while Huang followed with the Thunder Rolling strike. Their combined force landed true, drawing only a shallow wound. The Divine Demon's eyes flared like burning coals. In an instant, he released a devastating shockwave that smashed Jinshin's head into the ground, ending the venerable abbot's life in a single blow. Enraged and desperate, Guang and Huang charged once more. It was then revealed that the Divine Demon was none other than Zhang Qion, the man who had once plunged the Central Plains into rivers of blood, feared by all as the mightiest under heaven. Zhang Guang executed the Plum Blossom Rain, a technique so refined it stirred fragments of Zhang Qion's long-buried memories. For a fleeting moment, the shadow of his former self wavered, but it vanished as he invoked the demonic spirit sword art, fifth form, Black Dragon Execution, cleaving Guang's body in a single, merciless stroke. Huang, undeterred by the loss, launched the Infinite Emperor sword art, his blade finding its mark and carving deep into Zhang Qion's flesh. With a guttural growl, Zhang Qion spat blood and snarled, cursing the Namgung patriarch for his insolence before retaliating with monstrous might. Huang's fingers were severed, yet he refused to yield, his sword trembling but unwavering to eye in their final, fatal exchange. Huang drove his sword through Zhang Qion's back, piercing his heart, or so he thought. With grim resolve, Zhang Qion impaled himself further upon the blade, forcing it deeper, withdrawing the blade from his own chest, then swung his own sword in a blinding arc, severing Huang's head clean from his shoulders. As darkness claimed him, Huang's final thought echoed in disbelief. I struck his heart. How does he still live? Has he transcended the limits of man? When the dust settled, the alliance of the 9 great sects lay annihilated. Amid the silent sea of corpses, Zhang Qion stood alone, bloodied yet unbowed. Memories flooded his fading consciousness, his childhood steeped in hardship, the faces of his lost family, and the gentle smile of his beloved wife who had once urged him to find meaning in life. For one such as I, who knew nothing but killing, he whispered, you gave me a reason to live. After 15 years of slaughter and vengeance, Zhang Qion gazed upon the rising sun. Lowering his sword, he muttered softly, here lies the Divine Demon. With those words, his strength waned, and he collapsed into the embrace of death. A voice resounded, distant, irritated, and unfamiliar. What nonsense is this? Barging in like this? Do you think I'd sell my clan's martial arts for a handful of coins? Zhang Qion grimaced in confusion. So this is hell, he thought wearily, such a noisy place. Yet when he opened his eyes, he found himself not amid flames, but at different location. Before him stood a noble lady and her young son, flanked by guards. The woman declared coldly, since your elder brother suffered an unfortunate accident and can no longer inherit the clan's martial arts, my son shall receive the Flame Hua clan's secret techniques. Zhang Qion blinked in astonishment, utterly disoriented. He had no idea that he had been reborn. A defiant voice stepped forward, shouting in protest. Absolutely not. My elder brother is still alive and well. How can the clan's martial arts be given to outsiders? Beside him, a little girl cried out as well. And you're not even of direct blood. Even if my brother cannot train, grandfather's arts must remain within the Flame Hua clan. Observing them closely, Zhang Qion noticed a strange familiarity in their faces, an uncanny resemblance to his own. Then the lady's son, evidently of high standing, stepped forth and declared smugly, this will not end here. Very well, I'll make a proposal. His gaze fell upon Zhang Qion and 2 kids standing beside him, as he continued, I've heard that these 2 are so impoverished they can barely afford a meal. So, I'll wager a fortune, and your Wamujin will wager your clan's complete martial legacy. We shall duel, and the victor shall take everything." Zhang Qion remained silent, his expression unreadable. The man pressed on impatiently. "Well, what do you say?" At that moment, it was revealed that the body Zhang Qion now inhabited belonged to Wamujin. The two children beside him were his younger siblings. One of them exclaimed, "What? My brother couldn't even begin martial training because of his madness." The girl added furiously, "Do you take us for fools?" Bewildered, Zhang Qion muttered, "Who in the world is Wamujin?" Then, raising his gaze to the challengers before him, he spoke with the cold, imperious tone. "I am the divine demon, Zhang Qion." The man looked at Qion with a startled expression as he asked who he claimed to be. Qion replied that the world seemed to call him the divine demon. The man standing before him, wearing an uncomfortable expression, remarked that it was not even funny and suggested he might as well call himself the king of the underworld instead. It was revealed that he was Chang Dabo, the second son of the Changhua merchant group. Hearing his brother's comment, both siblings appeared embarrassed. Dabo's mother entered the room and said to Qion that his madness must be worsening by the day. She stated that with the clan's eldest son in such a condition, the fate of the Flamehua clan was already sealed. She identified herself as Buchoyan, master of the Changhua merchant group, and remarked with a sharp gaze that she spoke out of familial ties and sentiment, insisting her words were not bad advice for him either. With confident authority, she stated that nothing more needed to be said. Seeing the silence of the room, she declared that she would take it as acceptance of the duel. She announced that the duel would be held at the Baiyang Pavilion on the 5th day of the 2nd month. As she left, Dabo turned with a smug smile and told Qion that it was a promise made between martial artists, and that if Qion broke the duel agreement, he should know the consequences, addressing him mockingly as the divine demon Zhang Qion. After they departed, Qion's younger sibling expressed disbelief that they had decided everything on their own and asked what he would do, reminding him that he had never properly swung a sword before. Qion, surprised, asked whether she was referring to him. He began emanating a faint aura and remarked that calling him inexperienced was amusing, even hilarious, considering what even a beginner could do with a burst of inner energy. Before he finished speaking, he realized something was wrong. He could not sense his inner energy at all. His siblings watched in shock as he shouted that he had not a trace of inner energy. Anger filled his eyes as he demanded to know why his body was so weak and whether it could even hold a sword. The young girl shouted at him to stop. Qion stared at her, startled. With tears running down her face, she begged him to come to his senses, saying that even if he was in a state of madness, he could not behave like this. She cried out, demanding what kind of fool would take everything quietly. Her older brother reprimanded her, asking how she dared call their brother a fool and ordering her to apologize, but she refused. Crying, she shouted at Qion that it was all his fault their mother and father were dead. Qion said nothing, and she ran off. The little boy beside him explained softly that Qion might not remember, but she often lost control like that, and he asked for Chion's understanding. Hearing his words, Qion left. As he walked away, he thought that even children were treating him like a madman. The situation felt absurd. He remembered the moment he nearly cut off the Namgung clan patriarch's head and the sensation of his own heart being pierced, leaving him unable to breathe. He reflected that he had fulfilled vengeance for Yanawa and her siblings and should have been able to die peacefully. Instead, he found himself inside this unfamiliar body. He wondered how it had happened and who the children resembling Suk and Guang were. He thought about the girl calling him mad and dismissed it as nonsense. While he was deep in thought, someone ran toward him, asking him for going out again in such a frail condition, and asked if he had any idea how worried he had been. Qion looked at the man strangely and asked who he was, saying he seemed to know him. The man, seeing Chion's confusion, assumed it was another episode of madness that he introduced himself again as Maesok, vassal of the Flamehua clan. He explained that Wamujin had once been so talented and reputable that countless orthodox sects had sought him as a disciple. At the age of 23, he became clan leader. "And it was you." Maesok sighed wearily and revealed that this was the 6,225th time he had repeated this explanation. Qion acknowledged it and then asked why. If he had been so great, his energy core was now ruined. He also questioned the matter of madness and why everyone treated him as if he were insane. Maesok, worried, recalled the incident from 17 years ago when two young boys had stood opposite each other. One, the 6-year-old Mujin, had suggested they duel without using inner energy, and Dabo, then 9 years old, had agreed. Masak remembered how the two fought fiercely, emanating their own auras. Masak recalled the incident and informed Chion that he no longer remembered who had issued the challenge first. He explained that, in the absence of the elders from both families, the two of them had engaged in a duel entirely on their own accord. During the duel, young Mujin thought Dabo's skill was impressive, while Dabo praised him as the promising genius admired by the orthodox sections. Mujin was surprised by the sudden compliment, but before he could respond, Dabo struck him with inner energy. Mujin was shocked, and the punch sent him flying as Dabo approached the fallen Mujin. Blood dripped from Mujin's nose. Mujin asked why he had used the Seven Wounds fist when they had agreed to fight without inner energy. Dabo stood in front of him and asked if Mujin still considered him a friend. He admitted it had been the Seven Wounds fist of the Kongdong sect, and said its aftereffects were severe even with a single strike. He described testing it on his senior brother recently, leaving the man bedridden from one blow, and then struck Mujin again. After hearing this from Masak, Chion realized that everyone believed his current condition was the aftereffect of the Seven Wounds fist. Remembering the recent duel request, he thought that Dabo had crippled him into a lunatic with no energy core and then shamelessly demanded a duel. Chion asked Masak how they had dealt with Dabo back then for everything to turn into such a mess. Masak explained it had been the decision of the former clan patriarch. When Chion asked if that meant my father, Masak confirmed it. Because Dabo was his young cousin and the son of the powerful Changhua merchant group, ranked among the top 10 in the Central Plains, Chion's father had only scolded him and ended the matter. Chion, filled with contempt, questioned how his father could let the matter end with a mere reprimand when his own son had been crippled. Calling it a pathetic household, he walked away and asked where those so-called parents were now. Masak's expression grew sorrowful. A moment later, they arrived at the ancestral hall where Chion saw the altar. Masak explained that as Mujin's health worsened, his father had fallen into debt trying desperately to cure his madness. 9 years earlier, his mother's illness had worsened, and she had passed away. 3 years after that, burdened by debt, his father also died. Masak recalled the night of the ancestral ceremony, when members of the clan whispered among themselves that Mujin was a child who had devoured his parents. They blamed him for the clan's suffering and predicted its downfall. Masak continued, stating that all that remained were the debts accumulated for Mujin's sake, 2 loyal retainers, a few martial artists, and his younger siblings, Hua Dojin and Hua Soyan. Hearing this, Chion remembered why Soyan had shouted at him and understood her anger. He realized with sadness that one illness had destroyed the entire household. Later that night, in Mujin's room, Chion read through books. From them, he learned that after the war against the 9 great sects, the demon god Zhang Chion had indeed died, and 30 years had passed since then. The vividness of the world confirmed that this was reality. In short, he now inhabited the body of Hua Mujin, the Flame Hua clan's eldest son, a lunatic with no energy core. He reflected that he had no regrets from his previous life. Having killed those he needed to kill, he examined drawings and letters left by the siblings, wishing for Mujin's recovery. Their sincerity reminded him of children he had once known. Quietly, he accepted that he would need to live as Hua Mujin and thought he might help those children even a little. His greatest obstacle, however, was the Changhua merchant group, which had crippled this body and ruined the clan. He needed to prepare for the duel with Chang Dabo on the 5th day of the 2nd month. He intended to rebuild himself to at least the beginner level before then, but he lamented that he would have to begin martial cultivation from the very start. It reminded him of the first time he had learned martial arts when even breathing had been difficult. He began practicing a breathing technique and discovered that this body's innate martial aptitude was extraordinary. He did not even need the usual process of sensing energy. Simply closing his eyes was enough. Qi gathered rapidly at his dantian, growing fierce and overwhelming. The room brightened until a thunderous explosion echoed across the estate. Servants rushed into his chamber and found him unconscious on the floor. One checked his pulse, panicked at first, thinking he had died, then realized his pulse was stronger than ever. As he grabbed Chion's hand, he wondered why Chion seemed healthier. Chion, regaining consciousness from the pressure, shouted at him, demanding to know what was wrong with this body. He said that he had only tried to form an energy core but had been met with unbearable pain. The man was startled. Chion angrily asked if his body had some sort of special constitution. The man responded calmly that his constitution was said to be the heavenly martial body. Chion repeated the term in disbelief. The man explained that it was a rare heroic constitution chosen by the heavens, something a Shaolin elder had once told him. When the man laughed awkwardly, Xion grew more frustrated, but before he could react, he coughed up blood and collapsed again. He realized that the heavenly martial body was the exact opposite of a constitution suited for demonic arts. If a body of pure upright energy attempted to cultivate demonic techniques, it would suffer immense pain and could even die. That he listed the various heavenly constitutions, such as the heavenly slaughter body and heavenly flame body, and lamented that of all possibilities, he had received the one most incompatible with his skills. As he became conscious again, he heard Masak shouting for him to stay awake. Xion thought bitterly that he would not die so easily. When he asked who the two elderly men in the room were, Masak explained that they were the clan's chief steward and an elder. The white-haired man was Du Baixin, chief steward of the Flamehua clan, and standing before him was Zhou Huanbong, an elder of the clan. Huanbong remarked that the young master's symptoms were worsening and that they might need to prepare themselves. Xion grew frustrated, wanting to stop him but unable to move. He wondered what Zhou was thinking, while Masak pleaded for the young master not to die. Xion thought to himself that he was not going to die. A few days later, heavy rain poured over the Hua clan estate. Masak's voice echoed down the dim hall as he berated the bedridden Mujin, who had been confined for 3 full days. He followed closely behind as the young master walked unsteadily toward the wall, shouting in anxious frustration that Mujin should look at himself and question whether he was truly all right. While continuing forward, Mujin thought bitterly that 3 days had been wasted in this damned body, and at this rate, he would die before he could even duel. He halted for a moment, his face and body wrapped tightly in bandages, and told Masak to shut his mouth because the noise was making his head throb. More importantly, he declared that he would need a sword if he intended to duel, and he immediately ordered Masak to fetch several at once. Startled, Masak protested, explaining that they were struggling merely to secure their meals. How could they possibly afford a sword? Mujin, irritated, snapped back and asked whether this wretched household possessed no money at all. Masak explained that they were currently borrowing from an unorthodox group known as the Bangho sect, and due to their outrageous interest rates, the clan had accumulated a staggering amount of debt. Mujin lifted his head thoughtfully. A fallen clan, resolving the financial problem, had to come first. Leaning closer to Masak, he rested an elbow casually on the man's shoulder and smirked, remarking that since their debt was already enormous, adding a little more would hardly make a difference. Masak, horrified, asked whether he truly intended to borrow more money and whether he had gone insane. But Mujin ignored him, ordered him to be quiet, and instructed him to write a letter to the two elders stating that he would be going out for a walk after some time. When Elder Baixin read the letter, he grew frustrated, exclaiming that young Master Hua had gone to the Bangho sect again. Elder Huanbong, standing beside him, remarked indifferently that there was nothing to worry about. Surely the Bangho sect would simply kick him out. Baixin replied that the problem was not that. If Mujin ended up provoking them, the social sect might seize the opportunity to interfere. Elsewhere, at the Bangho sect's Lone Shark headquarters, Mujin and Masak stood before a massive man guarding the entrance door. Mujin looked him up and down and instructed him to inform the leader that while Mujin of the Flame Hua sect wished to meet him. The man, Kong Noho, replied with a cold gaze that if Mujin was there to gamble, he should stop spouting nonsense and go inside. Mujin stared at him and demanded to know why he could not do as told. If he could not, he should bring his superior instead. Irritated, Noho asked what he had just said. Masak, trembling beside them, hurriedly apologized and explained that their young master was a little unwell. Mujin glared at Noho sharply and asked what he was staring at. At that moment, another man approached, tossing a coin in his hand, and asked Noho what the issue was. Noho informed him that the young master wished to see the sect leader. Mujin glanced at the newcomer and asked if he was the superior. The man continued flipping the coin and asked why Mujin wanted to meet the leader. Mujin replied calmly that he wished to borrow more money. The man responded that in that case, there was no need to see the leader. He himself was sufficient. He introduced himself as Ma Zhengbo, the Bangho sect's vice leader, and gestured for them to follow. Later, they arrived at an underground chamber beneath the building, walking across a suspended wooden bridge inside a cavern. Masak whispered urgently beside Mujin that they could still turn back, as he had a very bad feeling about this. Mujin dismissed him, saying they had already come too far. Masak leaned closer, explaining that a few days earlier, Granny Shin of the city tea house had seen the Bangho sect leader battling an unaffiliated martial artist, and in a single instant, the man's chest had been split open. He added in a hushed tone that the sect leader was rumored to have mastered the Black Hand Twin Killer Power, Heavenly Martial Moonslaying Arts. Startled, Mujin asked what he meant. Masak repeated the name slowly. Hearing this, Jungbo, who was walking ahead, remarked that the servant seemed quicker to catch on than his master, though by now, it was too late to go back. Mujin sensed something amiss and noticed that guards wielding swords had already surrounded them. He responded calmly, asking whether this had been Jungbo's intention from the beginning. Jungbo turned slightly, a malicious expression on his face, saying that he could not very well beat the eldest son of the flame, Hua clan senseless at the entrance where there were too many eyes. He added darkly that for someone who wasn't even paying interest, Mujin had no shame, and he had no intention of letting him leech off them as his parents had. Masak immediately fell to his knees, begging the vice leader to spare the young master's life. Mujin corrected Jungbo coldly, stating that he had never had parents. For a moment, silence settled across the cave. Mujin realized he had been thinking of his former life as Zhang Qion. A subordinate raised his sword toward Mujin and asked Jungbo if they should begin. Jungbo told them to go ahead and simply teach the two a lesson. Masak trembled violently as one of the men suddenly seized Mujin and flung him high into the air, spinning him around while shouting that the arrogant brat would die. In midair, Mujin shifted his weight, caught the man's arm, and snapped it with a sharp twist. The man screamed as Mujin crashed onto the ground, yelling insults. Mujin replied coolly that a man of such size ought not to have such soft bones. He glanced at his own hand and thought that, with such a deteriorated body, using technique rather than brute strength was far wiser. Jungbo barked at his subordinates, asking what they were waiting for, and ordered them to finish Mujin. One rushed with a sword, another followed, but Mujin dodged each attack. Their frustration mounted as they increased their speed. Mujin observed calmly that since he could not match their strength, he needed to stay mobile. Spotting an opening, he smashed his forehead into one man's skull, sending him collapsing to the ground. Seeing this, Jungbo leaped forward, striking at Mujin's legs, but Mujin flipped backward, landed on his hands, twisted his hips, and unleashed a spinning kick that sent the attacker flying into a third guard behind him. Both crashed down in a heap. Masak asked fearfully whether Mujin was all right. Mujin replied dryly that it should be obvious he was fine. Masak stared in disbelief and asked where he had learned such martial arts. Mujin responded that it was not martial arts, merely something he had picked up living on the streets. Shocked, Masak asked when he had ever lived on the streets. Jungbo, impressed despite himself, praised Mujin's skills and challenged him to dodge the next move. He flicked the coin in his hand with tremendous force, aiming straight for Mujin. Mujin barely evaded it. A few strands of hair drifted to the ground. Astonished, he wondered if that had truly been just a coin. Jungbo ordered his men to step aside and declared that he would handle this personally. Mujin said he merely wanted to speak to the sect leader. Was that truly so difficult? Jungbo replied with a sharp gaze that someone like him had no right to meet the leader, then charged with killing intent. Mujin instantly drew a pair of chopsticks from his clothes and blocked the attack. Jungbo stared in shock that his sword had been stopped by chopsticks. Mujin thought that since he had no sword, he had simply brought substitutes, and they were proving surprisingly useful. Their clashes intensified, fierce and direct. Mujin noted internally that he had indeed heard Jungbo practiced some obscure martial arts. Then, spotting a brief opening, he shot a chopstick into Jungbo's wrist, forcing him to drop his sword. Jungbo groaned in pain as Mujin yanked the weapon free. Jungbo thought in disbelief that not only had the boy blocked his sword with chopsticks, he had exploited the opening to strike back. Enraged, he swung wildly, calling Mujin a brat. Mujin leaned back to avoid the blow. Jungbo muttered furiously that Mujin moved like a rat. Mujin replied that underestimating chopsticks could leave one regretting it, then spun multiple chopsticks in both hands, infusing them with his chi, and hurled them. Every single one hit its mark, making Jungbo clench his jaw in pain as he wondered how someone previously believed to possess no chi could reach such a level so quickly. He swung his sword again, but Mujin dodged effortlessly. Jungbo questioned whether this was truly the same Mujin of the Flame, Hua clan he knew. Seeing another opening, Mujin stabbed Jungbo once more with a chopstick. He commented casually that he had heard their clan had a mountain of debt. He struck again, this time piercing Jungbo's elbow, and added that he had wondered who their creditors might be. Yet the Bangho sect dared demand money with such pitiful skill. After several more exchanges, Jungbo leapt into the air, declaring that Mujin should taste the martial arts he had looked down upon. Mujin retorted jokingly that he had never done any such thing. Jungbo, enraged, shouted that the jokes were over and activated the Black Hand Twin Killer Power Heavenly Martial Moonslaying Arts, unleashing its ultimate strike. Mujin narrowed his eyes and told him the one joking was Jungbo himself. The attack surged forward, but Mujin dodged it cleanly. Jungbo was stunned that his ultimate move had missed. Seizing the opening, Mujin struck him with a powerful punch that sent the sword falling from Jungbo's grasp. Jungbo wondered why this brat had hidden such power until now. Blood spilled from Jungbo's mouth as he coughed violently. In a trembling voice, he demanded to know how Mujin intended to deal with the aftermath. Mujin replied sharply that he had no interest in listening to threats. But if Jungbo told him what he wanted to hear, he might extend his lifespan a little. With a cold, sinister gaze, Mujin repeated the only words he had come to say. He wanted alone. Would Jungbo give it? After some time, Mujin sat in a dim room, lounging back in a chair with a cigarette between his fingers. As he exhaled, he thought to himself that he had not felt such exhilaration in years. Masak, seated beside him, instantly snatched the cigarette away and scolded him, insisting it was terrible for his health. Mujin merely regarded the stolen stick with faint annoyance, thinking it a waste. Across from them sat Jungbo, his subordinates kneeling on either side in silent tension. Jungbo finally spoke, asking what it was that Mujin wished to know. Mujin leaned forward and demanded to know why the Bangho sect had granted a loan to the Flamehwa clan, especially when they loathed losing money and had required no collateral. He added that the entire situation reeked of malicious intent. With his head lowered, Jungbo replied that Mujin must be mistaken. There was no malice involved. Mujin interrupted sharply, claiming he could practically hear Jungbo's brain buzzing from where he sat. His gaze turned razor-sharp, his expression twisting into a deranged smile as he warned Jungbo to think carefully, unless he wished to have 30 or so of these dice shoved down his throat. Terrified by the change in Mujin's face, Jungbo froze. Mujin continued coldly, stating that Jungbo would be unable to speak even if he tried. Panicked, Jungbo confessed that the orders had come from the Changhua merchant group. Mujin muttered that he had suspected those rats from the beginning and demanded to know what kind of deal the sect had struck with them. Jungbo hesitated, but Mujin hurled the dice onto the table and mocked him, telling him not to pretend to be some venerable sage. Loyalty, he said, should be saved for one's underlings, because the merchant bastards would not care even if Jungbo's limbs were severed and this entire building burned down tonight. Startled into submission, Jungbo revealed the truth. There existed a secret contract. The Changhua merchant group had ordered the Bangho sect to lend the Flamehwa clan as much money as they required, with an interest rate so monstrous it would drag the clan into the depths of debt. In return, once the clan collapsed, the Bangho sect would receive the Flamehwa lands along with lucrative rewards. Mujin examined the contract with calm derision. So the land was the true prize. He asked how much the 300 gold niang he planned to borrow would become after a year. Jungbo answered that, according to the contract, it would amount to 5,000 gold niang. Mujin scoffed, calling them amusing fools, and tossed the contract aside before moving on. Fixing Jungbo with another cold stare, he asked who was responsible for cleaning up the Bangho sect's messes. Jungbo answered that it was the Social sect, one of the four martial heavens, an alliance of unorthodox sections. Mujin expressed mild surprise, noting he had never heard of such a sect within the four martial heavens. Jungbo explained that they had joined only recently. With a thoughtful expression, Mujin murmured that the four martial heavens were troublesome people. Masak leaned toward him and whispered that Mujin had never even met them, so he had no idea what he was talking about. Mujin dismissed him, saying he did not feel like explaining anything. He then asked Jungbo why the man sent to fetch the money was taking so long. At that moment, the man in question rushed into the room carrying a box. Jungbo immediately presented the chest to Mujin, announcing that it held the 300 gold niang. Mujin rose from his seat, eyes brightening at the sight of the gold. After inspecting it, he declared that it was sufficient, then ordered Masak to accompany him. Masak hesitated, asking if they were truly borrowing the money. Mujin snapped at him to be quiet at the entrance. Mujin instructed Jungbo to record the loan in their ledger. With a stern tone, he added that once he settled matters with the Changhua merchant group, he would return to pay the debt. He also warned Jungbo to stop extorting peasants or else he would personally deal with them. Shaken, Jungbo watched him leave and muttered to himself, wondering who would be beaten first, the Bangho sect or the Flamehwa clan's mad young master. When Mujin returned to the estate, Baeksin immediately noticed blood on his clothes and demanded to know what had happened. Mujin calmly stated that the blood was not his. Huanbong stood beside them as Baeksin asked what had occurred at the Bangho sect. Mujin replied that he had merely gone to borrow some money, since the clan needed funds. Huanbong glared at him in disbelief. Ignoring the stare, Mujin added that they needed to properly feed their martial artists. Otherwise, they would start deserting. When Baeksin saw the heavy chest trembling in Maesok's hands, he asked where Mujin had stolen it from, insisting there was no way the Bangho sect had willingly lent them more. Mujin repeated that he had told them to write it in their books, and instructed Baeksin to simply worry about clothing and feeding his siblings well. Wishing them good luck, he walked away. Baeksin, watching Mujin's departing figure, asked Huanbong whether he had ever heard of a disease that could make someone behave this strangely. Huanbong merely clicked his tongue in response. Later, Mujin lit candles before the ancestral altar dedicated to his deceased parents. He quietly admitted that, having never truly had parents, he did not know what one was supposed to say in moments like this. He informed them that the financial problem had been temporarily handled, so they need not worry. He promised to take good care of his siblings and the servants and told them to rest peacefully. Unseen in the shadows, his younger siblings, Dojin and Soyeon, listened silently as he spoke. Mujin went on, saying that he had agreed to duel an idiot named Chong Dabo in a few days for the clan's secret scroll. With a faint smirk, he told the altar not to worry. He would simply break the man's neck. When morning arrived, 3 clan warriors hauled large wooden crates out of Mujin's quarters. After dropping them with a thud, one complained that whatever was inside felt heavy enough to snap his spine. Maesok dismissed them, thanking them for their work. As they left, one warrior muttered that at least the job was done and suggested they go for a drink. Moments later, Mujin stepped out and asked Maesok whether the contents were correct: 50 jin, 80 jin, and 110 jin. After checking the labels, he nodded in satisfaction. Inside one box lay a massive longsword. Maesok stared at it in confusion and asked what Mujin intended to do with such a monstrous blade. Mujin smiled brightly and answered that he planned to swing it, of course. He reached for the 50 jin sword first, calling it the easiest, but the moment he attempted to lift it, the blade slammed back onto the floor. Maesok stared at him in disbelief, asking whether he truly planned to swing something so absurdly heavy. Mujin remained silent, gripping the sword and thinking that he had suspected this might happen, but he had not expected to be unable to lift even 50 jin. This body, he thought bitterly, was utterly useless. Still, he refused to give up. With trembling arms in both hands, he managed to raise the sword slightly. He ordered Maesok to stop staring and follow his instructions. He also told him to include plenty of meat in his meals. Maesok muttered under his breath that he could not help worrying. Inside the room, Mujin tied the sword to his left hand with cloth. Lifting it with both hands, he reminded himself that only half a month remained until the duel. His current body possessed the heavenly martial constitution, the exact opposite of the demonic arts his master had taught him. Therefore, he had no choice but to learn the martial arts of his master's friend. The peerless 9 swords, he swung the massive blade through the air, then settled into a sword stance, eyes closing as he reaffirmed that this was the only path to survival. Meanwhile, at the Changhua Merchant Guild, Dabo played the Hegium while listening to a report. Upon hearing that Mujin had beaten the Bangho syndicate to the point that they could not move for 2 weeks, he paused. He asked how such a feat was possible when Mujin lacked an energy core. With a twisted smile, he remarked that perhaps Mujin was not as insignificant as he had assumed. He added that he should prepare a gift for the Flamehua clan's heir, and murmured that he was genuinely excited for their upcoming duel. He wondered aloud what hidden side Mujin might reveal. Several days passed, during which Mujin continued honing his martial arts in the courtyard. He vaulted high into the air and landed solidly on both feet. A faint glimmer crossed his eyes as he reflected inwardly that this must be the heavenly martial body. If it was truly a body granted by the heavens, he thought, then it ought to withstand at least this much. Later, in another room, he had arranged an assortment of wooden traps for further practice. Before beginning, he acknowledged silently that Maesok had prepared everything he had requested. Declaring inwardly that his session began now, he executed the first movement of the solitary 9 swords. First form, declaration form. As he advanced, he thought that he would carry his sword and move forward at any time, and that not even Mount Tai would dare obstruct his path. He transitioned into Form 2, breaking form, and reflected that no matter what weapon emerged before him, he would shatter them all. A sharp pain flared in his dantian as he completed the motion, forcing him to grit his teeth. He admitted to himself that even this small exertion was pushing his limits, yet he resolved to endure. He kicked a wooden ball, sending it ricocheting violently throughout the room. With his eyes closed, he dodged its wild trajectory as it hurled back toward him, then unleashed Form 3, sky-cleaving form, slicing the ball cleanly in half. He believed that even if an enemy's energy shook the heavens, his blade would divide it. A sudden stab of pain shot up his back, making him cry out. After regaining composure, he tugged a rope that triggered another trap from the ceiling. Multiple bamboo poles plummeted toward him. He assumed a stance, tracked their descent, and delivered Form 4, void-cleaving form, thinking that no martial art could withstand this edge. All complicated techniques, he believed, fell before natural counterplay. Thus, the simplest sword could sever them. His swing sent bamboo scattering across the room, slamming into the walls with terrifying force. But when he looked toward the rope he had intended to hit, he realized he had missed entirely and shouted in frustration that he hadn't landed a single strike. As the remaining bamboo struck the wall, one piece accidentally severed another rope, releasing yet another trap. This time, heavy wooden logs cascaded downward. He responded instantly with fifth form, army slaughtering form, thinking that even if hordes of enemies swarmed him, they would bow before his blade. Against absolute strength, numbers meant nothing. He cleaved the logs in half, but one stray log crashed onto his head, provoking a furious shout that this was utter nonsense. Next, he approached bamboo poles with lit candles inside them. Positioning himself, he performed sixth form, 1/parts still water, believing that even a leaf floating atop still water would be split by his blade. He declared aloud that this set of traps was now deactivated. Outside, he approached a stone statue and executed seventh form, 1 Twin Earth, thinking that if his sword could sunder the ground, then size no longer mattered. When the statue remained completely unharmed, he stared at it and demanded to know why it was still perfectly intact. After some time, he invoked eighth form, heaven-sundering form, thinking that even the sky itself would yield before this blade, and questioned whether anything in the world remained beyond his ability to cleave. He flowed seamlessly into the final movement, ninth form, self-cleaving form. He declared that by cutting both himself and his sword, he had no further reason to wield a blade. As soon as the technique concluded, his sword slipped from his grasp, and he collapsed to the ground, his eyes fluttering shut. He murmured that in the end, it was all mere mimicry. A memory from his past life surfaced, his old master explaining that this was the final self-cleaving form and asking whether he had memorized it. As a child, Zhang Qion had replied that he had, but wondered aloud whether such an unworthy sword style deserved to be called a sword art. The explanations, cutting earth, sky, blade, and oneself, sounded, to him, like something a child invented to appear impressive. His master, troubled, admitted he understood the sentiment, yet could not let his close friend's sword legacy die. He had been unable to carry it on himself and wanted Qion to inherit it. He explained that the man who created the technique had once been the only swordsman able to stand toe-to-toe with him. When Qion questioned how that was possible without inner power, his master surmised that the man had used a moving internal skill. The creator had insisted the technique be passed to someone outside any sect, since those raised within a sect would never fully grasp it. His master continued, if one swung this sword style 1,000 times, the body would begin to change. At 100,000 swings, one would emit sword aura. At 1,000,000 swings, few beneath heaven would be able to match them. Qion calculated aloud that if one performed 1,000 swings a day, the technique could be mastered in 3 years. Curious, he asked whether the creator had truly been as strong as his master. The reply was uncertain, yet if they fought to the end, one of them would surely die. The memory dissolved when Masak discovered Mujin asleep on the ground. He slapped Mujin repeatedly until he stirred, shouting in panic. Mujin told him to wait, while Masak insisted he had been worried because Mujin would not wake up. Mujin warned him that another slap would cost him his life. Rising shakily, he wondered how he had fainted after only one form, far from even 1,000 swings a day. The road ahead remained long. Masak brought him a tray of food and urged him to eat despite the late hour. Mujin pointed at a dish, asking whether it was pork. Masak answered that Mujin had requested meat-side dishes the night before. Since they had gone so long without meat, he suggested they enjoy it. Mujin held the meat between his chopsticks and instructed that beginning tomorrow, all meals should use beef instead. Masak hesitated at the word beef, prompting Mujin to explain that beef built muscle better. If finances became a problem, he said, Masak should use funds from the loan syndicate and inform the butler not to worry. He would borrow more later. Until his duel with Chong Dabo, he intended to eat 3 meat-based meals a day. Masak, still troubled, asked when Mujin had started learning martial arts. Mujin questioned whether it was strange. Someone who had barely functioned as a normal person was suddenly mastering sword techniques. Masak recalled the incident with the Bangho sect, remarking that Mujin had once beaten armed guards using a chopstick and now wielded an absurd sword style. Mujin swallowed his food and said he had already told the children, so sharing with Masak did not matter. He revealed that he was not truly the eldest son, Wam Mujin. His real identity was the divine demon. Masak declared that if Mujin planned to spout nonsense again, he was leaving. He said he worried about only one thing, that Mujin might one day lose his memory again and disappear without explanation. Mujin asked whether he feared he would abandon the Yoma clan. He set down his chopsticks and assured Masak he would never abandon them. Not until Yoma became the strongest martial family in Sichuan. Beyond that ambition, he said, he had little else to pursue. When Masak repeated the words strongest in Sichuan, Mujin confirmed them. Masak dismissed the idea as ridiculous, earning a sharp flick to the forehead. Mujin told him that if he was done talking, he should leave. Masak rose, muttered a curt farewell, and departed. Afterward, Mujin reflected on his own declaration, the strongest in Sichuan. Surely that should satisfy even Wam Mujin. Later that night, in the elders' quarters, Huanbong stood by the window gazing at the sky while Baixin poured tea. Huanbong noted that in 10 days, the duel between Chong Dabo and young Master Mujin would take place. Baixin lowered his head and replied that Chong Dabo would undoubtedly try to kill the young master and afterwards seek the Yom Emperor's inheritance. Huanbong asked whether they should flee before that happened. Baixin turned sharply, stunned, as Huanbong urged him to think carefully. They could not allow the last 2 remaining members to be harmed as well. Several days passed as Mujin continued his relentless training. After one particularly exhausting session, he stood alone in the training yard, gasping for breath as sweat streamed down his face. Frustration twisted his expression as he glanced at his arm, his chest heaving. Through ragged breaths, he assessed himself coldly. Simply swinging a sword every day had carved visible muscle into his arms. He had finally reached the point where he could wield a 110-gun iron sword with a single hand, and yet his swordsmanship remained unstable. With only a week left before the martial arts competition, the realization gnawed at him. Power alone was not enough that a familiar voice suddenly echoed from the distance. When Mujin turned, he saw his younger siblings, Dojin and Soyan, standing near the entrance. Their faces were tense with worry as they asked whether he was still training so relentlessly. Mujin frowned slightly and questioned why they had come, warning them that the place was dangerous and telling them to go elsewhere to play. Dojin, however, spoke up with concern, saying he had been watching for several days and felt that Mujin was pushing himself too far. Soyan hesitated before asking whether he was training this hard because of the harsh words she had spoken to him before. Her voice trembled as she admitted that she had been angry at the time and hadn't meant what she said. Mujin looked at them quietly. Seeing the 2 of them stirred memories he would rather not dwell on. Still, he reached out and gently patted their heads, telling them not to worry, that everything was fine. Suddenly, Dojin excitedly raised his arm and began imitating one of Mujin's sword stances, proudly claiming that this was how it was done. Soyan immediately disagreed, correcting him and insisting that Mujin stretched his arm farther. As the siblings began bickering, Mujin watched in silence, amused despite himself. Their clumsy imitation was crude, yet strangely endearing. Their argument pulled him into a memory from long ago that he remembered himself as a youth, standing before his master, enduring a stern lecture. His master's voice echoed clearly in his mind. When swinging the sword, exhale for as long as possible, then hold. Never rush. When returning to the stance, inhale, slowly and briefly. Only then would the sword obey its wielder. When the memory faded, realization struck him like lightning. The most critical aspect of the solitary 9 swords was not brute force, but the breathing method of the practitioner. He had forgotten his master's teachings entirely. With a faint smile, Mujin reassured his siblings that he would definitely win. He ushered them out of the training room, firmly telling them to return to their quarters before closing the door behind them. Outside, Dojin and Soyan stared at the shut door, exchanging uneasy glances as they wondered inwardly whether everything would truly be all right. That night, heavy rain poured over the Wa clan estate. Mujin continued training indoors, his movements now guided by memory rather than frustration. As he swung his sword, he carefully followed the rhythm his master had taught him. Long exhalation, controlled pause, measured inhalation. He executed the fifth form, Army Slayer, pouring all the internal energy he had gathered into a single, decisive motion. The technique concluded cleanly that a grin spread across his face as he realized he had succeeded. Without hesitation, he shifted his stance and continued into the next sequence, his breathing deep and stable as he trained. Mujin reflected on pupil, the movement-based qigong that built internal energy through physical motion rather than meditation. Compared to other methods that focused on circulating energy through stillness, pupil was considered a lower-class martial art, one that offered limited development of the energy channels. Yet Mujin understood something crucial. O awakened pupil. What mattered most was not raw talent, but stable breathing. With each repetition, his movements grew smoother, his body steadier. After dozens of cycles, the scattered energy in his dantian, dormant for years, began to condense at last. By the time the sun set, a subtle change had taken root within him. In the kitchen, Masak prepared Mujin's meal, while Huanbong approached from behind, asking whether the young master was still training. Masak hurriedly covered the food and answered with a bright smile, saying that Mujin had become a completely different person. Though he had collapsed repeatedly at first, he now showed no signs of weakness. With shining eyes, Masak added that the divine energy treatment Mujin had received from the Mudong seemed to have been effective. Huanbong fell silent, unease creeping into his expression. Even the treatment of Wudong Baixian should not yield such results in a single session, or so he believed. He instructed Masak to report immediately if anything unusual occurred, but before he could finish speaking, Masak had already rushed off with the meal. Left behind, Huanbong clicked his tongue quietly. Moments later, Masak arrived at the training yard to call Mujin for dinner, and froze. The outer wall lay in ruins, reduced to rubble. Stuttering in disbelief, Masak demanded to know what had happened. Mujin replied calmly that the area was too narrow. When Masak asked what he meant, Mujin exhaled heavily, sweat pouring down his face, and explained that it was impossible to continue training in such a confined space. With eyes full of enthusiasm, he gazed toward the sky and declared that he would use the clan's main training ground from now on. When Mujin and Masak arrived at the Wa clan's training hall, several warriors were already present. They glared at Mujin with open disgust. Mujin glanced at the stairs and remarked that there were guests. Nervously, Masak explained that the young master intended to use the large training ground. Before he could finish, the warrior's eyes sharpened with hostility. Mujin stabbed his great sword into the ground and calmly gestured for them to leave, stating that he needed to train alone and that another training ground was available nearby. The warriors bristled with rage, thinking bitterly that merely swinging a sword did not make one a martial artist, especially not one whose blade had never tasted blood. Sensing their hostility, Mujin released a trace of malevolent intent and remarked that their gazes were rather provocative. One warrior stepped forward to protest, but another stopped him. Addressing the group, the man ordered them to stand down, identifying himself as Keelboyne, commander of the Yomwa clan's death squad. At his words, the others withdrew, muttering among themselves that the young master's madness had resurfaced. Mujin heard the comment. He called out mockingly, asking the dull-witted warrior why he did not stop. Keelboyne turned, irritation flashing across his face. Mujin met his gaze sharply and told them that if you had complaints, they should voice them openly. Bottling them up was the behavior of cowards. Keelboyne asked what Mujin was suggesting. Mujin answered plainly. Among those who lived by the sword, grievances were settled through combat. Pointing his massive blade directly at Keelboyne, he proposed they fight it out. Keelboyne scoffed, smirking as he replied that no warrior would draw a sword against the future clan head, no matter how twisted the world became. Mujin responded coldly, remarking that a dog that bites does not bark, and that barking dogs were filled with fear. When Keelboyne remained silent, Mujin pressed on, telling him that if he had no intention of stepping forward, he should not bark in the first place, and that he might as well live with his tail between his legs. Enraged, Keelboyne immediately gripped his sword and unsheathed it, swinging it into position as he warned that regret would come too late. Mujin raised his greatsword, settling into a stance with a faint smirk, implied that regret was something he had never relied on.